Welcome to the World War I podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore a wide range of interesting topics related to World War I. In the history of the United States, 31 of 45 presidents have served in the military, and 24 of them have served during wartime. Yet only one president was a combat veteran of World War I, and that was President Harry S. Truman. The war shaped an entire generation of leaders, and Truman himself made it clear that his service profoundly influenced his life and his vision of leadership. To explore his World War I service and its impact, we are joined today by Mark Adams, director of the Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Amanda. Glad to be here.
So to start us off, can you give us a quick sketch of Truman's life prior to World War I?
Sure. He's born in 1884 in Missouri, in Lamar, Missouri. As a child, his family moves to Independence, which becomes his hometown for the rest of his life, around the ages of 4 or 5 years of age. And then he graduates high school in Independence in 1901 at the age of 17. And then he has a few different jobs for a while. He serves as a timekeeper for the railroad. He works as a bank clerk in a couple of different banks in Kansas City, which is only about 20 minutes now from Independence, so not too far for him to travel to do that bank job. And he actually gets great reviews. We've got some in the archives here that have his kind of reviews of how well he's doing as a bank clerk. He's a meticulous note taker and record keeper. But then in 1906, his family calls on him to come help on the family farm. So his family has a farm in Grandview, Missouri, just south of Independence. And they have a 600-acre farm. So it's quite the business. His father runs that business, and he has 2 siblings as well, and then his mother. And they're all working together as kind of these Missouri farmers. Things changed a little bit in 1914. 8 years into being a farmer, his father passes away. So then Harry Truman is now in charge of the farm, which is not really his ambition. And he had started dating Bess Wallace Truman, Bess Wallace at the time, of course, around 1910. And the reason I bring that up is he's writing lots and lots of letters to her. And we have those letters. So a lot of what we know about Harry Truman from 1910 forward are from those letters that we have from him to her. There are more than 1,300 letters in total. And so that time period, 1910, till we get to World War I in 1917, he's complaining about being on the farm. He does not like it. It's hard work. He's been put in charge in 1914. And so that's kind of what his career looks like up until that point. He gets kind of his first taste of leadership, being put in charge of the farm, even though he didn't really want to be there. It's hard work. It's not particularly profitable. So he's trying some other things, oil and gas speculation in particular in Oklahoma and in the Dakotas, and he's traveling around trying to make more money, quite frankly. Some people speculate that's because his girlfriend, Bess Wallace, comes from a richer family, and he's trying to match that income or match that financial status. He fails to do that. So in many ways, he's kind of stuck on the farm, but that's what things look like in 1917.
So at that point, the U.S. enters the war. He's in his early 30s at this point. Technically, he's too old for the draft, correct?
Correct.
He's doing some essential war work as a farmer, and we know that his eyesight wasn't great. So all of these would seem to be reasons why he could have very easily avoided service in World War I, but he doesn't. So can you walk us through his reaction to the U.S. entry into the war and his path then into military service?
Yeah, it is an interesting piece. I bring up the farming earlier because I think some historians have argued that he wanted to get away from the farm, and this gave him an excuse to do so. You are right, he's too old for the draft. He's doing a very important job as a farmer, keeping the nation fed in the breadbasket of the nation in the Midwest. But at the same time, he is very patriotic. He does kind of go along with the tenor of the times. He is a supporter of Woodrow Wilson anyway, and he's struck by Wilson's speeches and bringing the United States into the war. So I think it's a mixture of patriotism, a mixture of trying something different, not be on the farm any longer. I think the patriotism is probably the most important. The other piece of it, we can talk more about this, he's also from 1905 to 1911, he was in the Missouri National Guard. So although he wasn't in combat, he certainly had a lot of military training in that and been promoted to lieutenant at that point. And so he does have that skill set and that training and military mindset as we get into 1917.
So he technically rejoins what the
Missouri National Guard.
Missouri National Guard.
It's eventually federalized, but initially it's the Missouri National Guard. And he is actually the way they did the election. They did actually elections for the officers then. And so he's elected lieutenant, and that's many people kind of point to that later and say that's the first election that he ever wins, which is kind of funny to think of it that way.
Right.
But it makes him pretty proud. He's, that people think of him that way, that they want to put him in a position of leadership. This seems strange when you think of World War I and World War II and technology, but he's a very good horseman, and that actually makes a difference. And then he's put in charge of recruiting. And back then, in World War I time, similar to Civil War, as they set up the different regiments, they've done so locally and regionally. So he's recruiting in Kansas City in particular to get people to volunteer, and he's good at that. He's got a car. At that point, he got a car earlier, around 1914. So he's driving around and he's trying to he's recruiting in Kansas City before he goes off into training in Oklahoma, which I could talk about in a little bit if you'd like.
Yes, please do. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so he's doing that recruitment in Kansas City. It is very much a Kansas City branch of the military in a sense, which is very different than what we see today. So that's why I mentioned the fact that they're recruiting locally and they're all assigned locally, which is good because everybody knows each other, but you have this threat, of course, that a whole town, a whole community could lose all of these soldiers. He's actually not an infantryman. He's actually in the field artillery. And for those that know more about World War I, he's actually eventually going to be in charge of Battery D as a captain. He's promoted it to captain when he gets to France. But while he's in Oklahoma, they're teaching him and the soldiers, how to fire the artillery. When they get to France, there's more training. But he's in Oklahoma for quite some time. I mentioned his car. He actually takes his car to Oklahoma, which is a neat, interesting part of the story because he ends up setting up an army canteen of supplies for the soldiers. And most of these canteens don't do very well. He partners with his first army friend, Eddie Jacobson, who was from Kansas City and Jewish. And the two of them together start this canteen. And because they have a car, they're really in a remote part of Oklahoma, not a hill in sight, very windy, lots of letters back to Bass about the awful conditions there. They're able to drive to some small towns nearby and get supplies that the soldiers would want. And so their canteen is pretty successful. And they become very close friends, Eddie and Harry Truman do. Later, after World War I, they actually opened a clothing store together in 1919. So they become lifelong friends. And it's the first of very, very important friendships that Truman gets through his World War I training and service. And then after that long training in Oklahoma, they go to New York City. They ship out from New York City. Then they're in Western France and they go through more training. And this is really important. They get to learn, they'd had some experience of this, but they got a lot more in Western France of learning how to use the French 75 millimeter guns. And Truman, we have his diaries and his letters to Bess and others, his cousins and his sister, that tell us a lot about this. As you know, he didn't go to college. He's the last president not to go to college. This was like a college crash course for him in algebra and trigonometry, because they've got to measure the wind speed and the mud that they're laying, the caissons in, and all of these different things that go into firing accurately. But as soon as he's finished training, he's then put in charge of training other people. So it was a really, to excuse the pun, but a baptism of fire, because he's really put in the front lines training other people how to do this. Ultimately, his unit becomes one of the most efficient, not just at being accurate and firing accurately, but more importantly, in some ways, packing and unpacking the unit. They're a very mobile artillery unit, so they're being told to move very quickly. So when they're getting to the front, they've got to pack up onto trains, and they've got the horses, they got the caisson, they got the ammunition, they got the field gun, and just under 200 men in the unit. And all of them have to get transported by a train. The goal was about 60 minutes, and Truman's unit broke the record, apparently. Maybe it was Truman boasting, I don't know. But they were able to all pack on the train in 48 minutes, which, if you think of the efficiency of the war, that kind of efficiency is what Truman was known for. So that led them then to the front, which we can talk more about. But that was the training element of it. And it's not really until he gets to France that he's actually finds out that he's promoted to be captain, and he becomes captain of this Battery D, which was another lesson for him.
Well, tell us about Battery D and how the feelings of the men in Battery D perhaps evolved about him.
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's really kind of the key point for Truman. It's almost a turning point. He describes as being terrified by this unit. They're kind of an unruly bunch. They have kind of a bad reputation. As I mentioned before, they're all locally from Kansas City. And in particular, this group are primarily Irish and German Catholics. And they'd gone through 3 or 4 captains previously to Truman. So they do have a pretty bad reputation. Then you think of Harry Truman, and he's not the tallest man. He has these wireframe glasses. He actually bought 6 pairs of those in New York City before he left because he was so afraid of losing those. And he's standing in front of 198 men who are being pretty unruly anyway when he's on the grounds inspecting them. Doesn't really say much. Whether that was a strategy. He admits somewhere in his memoirs that he was so terrified he couldn't speak. Some of his men, we have their oral histories from later, talk about Truman's knees knocking together, and he looked pretty terrified and not a very imposing figure. His medical records, that he did before going off to France, say that he's about 5'8". We at the library usually say he's about 5'9", but he's about 5'8". He's legally blind in one eye. There's rumors that he memorized the eye chart to get through the test, but he's pretty terrified. Now, they're already kind of rambunctious. They've got a new captain. As they dismiss from the parade ground, they give him a Bronx cheer. And then that night, they're riding the horses around and getting drunk and causing all kinds of ruckus, the training ground. Truman doesn't go out and lecture them and give a huge speech or anything like that. He pins a note on the bulletin board, and the not commissioned officers are demoted. The lower officers are busted down to private, and they suddenly realize that he means business. He brings in those officers that were not part of what was going on and tells them, I don't have to get along with you. You have to get along with me. And that was kind of his leadership style. Quite quiet, quite reserved, but no nonsense. And then after that, we've got his notebooks where he's giving fines for misdemeanors and different things that go on. And he keeps a meticulous notebook of this person's been charged this amount and this person's been charged this amount, or if they've been busted down. But what he also does is he improves their food. He tells them all to write home every day to their mothers and families and wives and girlfriends, and improves their food and rationing and so forth within the training that they're going through. And in the end, they come to respect him. So you talked about evolution. In the end, they do come back with a lot more respect for him, realize he means business. And then there's things that happen at the front when we get into some of the various battles and things like that, that really lead to a great respect for him. A couple of examples of later in life, or one shortly at the end of the war and then later in life in 1949. On the ship home in 1919, because they don't leave France until spring of 1919, the soldiers in Battery D present him with a cup called a loving cup. It's like a large trophy. We have it on display in the museum, which he displays in the clothing store that he owns and operates after he leaves World War I. So that gave you a sense of the measure of respect for him. And then in 1949, after he won the 1948 election, in the 1949 inaugural, By that time, there were 138 surviving members of Battery D. So we'd lost around 60. 79 of them marched in the 1949 inaugural parade as Battery D veterans. And that tells you, I mean, that's, you can do the math, that's 30 years later. I think that's right. Was it 20 years later? 29, 39, 49, 30 years later, you've got 75% of the surviving members marching in the presidential inaugural parade. They had annual reunions and things like that too. And some of the last photographs of Truman in 1972 are a couple of members of Battery D coming to visit him at the home, which is just 4 blocks here from the library that he lived in for the rest of his life. So a lot of respect for him, really evolved, as you said. From the time they first saw him, he didn't seem very intimidating to being really a fine leader.
Yeah, it's very clear that he was just a tremendous leader for them, and that, as you said, decades later, they are still supporting him and still really fans of his, almost in some ways, like tremendous amount of respect for him. Now, there is a persistent story, and it's one that we often hear at the MacArthur Memorial, and that is that Truman and MacArthur met and clashed in World War I after some sort of artillery mishap that, you could lay at Truman's feet. Did this happen? Set the record straight for us. And did they even meet during this war?
I found no record that they've met in World War I. Now, there was an artillery mishap with a different colonel, which I can talk about, but just to put the record straight, and if anybody has any evidence or any documents correcting me on this, I'd love to see it. But I found no evidence that they met in World War I. Mm-hmm. In fact, oftentimes people say the first time they met was at Wake Island, during the Korean War. Again, if anyone's got anything to correct any of that, I'd love to get the record straight. But as far as I'm aware, in the evidence we have at the Truman Library, we don't have any evidence of that. Now, there was an artillery mishap that he got in trouble with Colonel Carl Clem, not MacArthur, where he had joined the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He fired out of sector. They were told to fire directly in front of them only during this large land offensive. And he saw his group of men and his battery were set up in some hills, and they noticed the German artillery barrage coming from out of his sector. So his official orders were not to fire out of the sector. He got all of his measurements set and didn't hesitate and told his men to fire on the German group. They were very accurate. They were able to destroy that German unit, a similar unit to his, the artillery unit. And then they moved very quickly, which is what I was talking about before. You have to unload and pack up and move out. Because if you're sending these 75 millimeter guns at the enemy, other parts of the enemy are going to see where you're at. And they're easy to target. They're pretty noticeable. And so they got out of that sector very quickly after doing that. Colonel Clem, that I mentioned, Carl Clem, he was outraged at this. And at one point was threatening court-martial. But as the reports came through that they'd been accurate and that they had destroyed this unit, it all kind of frittered away. There were a couple of other times that Truman got in hot water with some of the colonels, but that's the most significant one.
So from the MacArthur Memorial side, we agree. There is kind of no record of them meeting in World War I. Wake Island, I think, is the first time for sure. And I think we've looked too, in terms of, MacArthur's with the 42nd, Truman's with this artillery battery. I don't think they're ever anywhere near each other. I mean, they're both veterans of the Meuse-Argonne kind of campaign, but they're nowhere near each other where anything like this could have happened. And I think it's mostly people just trying to find a World War I reason for them to have had some friction later. And obviously, as you and I both know very well, there is friction between them later in the Korean War, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And if you'd like to learn more about that, Mark did a really wonderful talk at the MacArthur Memorial a few months ago. I think it is part of our MacArthur Memorial podcast series now, and we will have a link to that in this episode description. But going back to Truman and this experience of World War I, it does seem that he, while an officer himself, is not always a fan of perhaps other officers, maybe field grade or, general officers all the time, or of people that court or attract a lot of press coverage. Do you think this shapes his views of, say, MacArthur later on, or of perhaps military leaders more broadly in the future?
I think so. He had failed to get into West Point himself because of his eyesight. He has different relationships. First of all, in World War One, Colonel Clem, he didn't get along with him, but there were other officers in World War One that he did get along with. It's interesting in the Truman MacArthur era, Truman is very, very respectful and thinks very highly of, for example, of George Marshall, but then less so of MacArthur and others. So I think sometimes he described them as being kind of showmanship and things like that. So when you're talking about those that like to attract attention, good or bad, that seemed to rankle with him, I would say. So, that seems to fit what you're saying in terms of those that, whether it's media attention or public attention, he didn't like to do that himself. And I think he didn't particularly get along with people that kind of what his phrase would be grandstanding or something like that. So I think there's a little bit more there. But I do think his own failure to get into West Point probably factors in a little bit as well. There comes some jealousy maybe there or something. But in the end, for Truman, it always comes down to the individual. There are some people that he's met that he didn't get along with at first. And then later on, as the relationship, developed, he would warm to people that he didn't think kindly of first. A really strange example, completely off topic, but Thomas Hart Benton, the artist, not the senator, who painted a huge mural here in the Truman Library Museum when Truman worked here. When they were first introduced to each other, they did not get along at all. And they're only 5 years apart. They're both born in Missouri, but they really didn't get along. By the time Benton finished the painting here, which took about 2 to 3 years, they were close friends and they were sharing a drink in his office. So often when Truman got to know somebody a little better, maybe playing poker, maybe sharing a drink, then he would warm to them. So I think that's a little bit more about his character and his personality. He'd often have maybe a preconceived idea about somebody and then warm to them as they develop that relationship.
Interesting. Now, is it true that Battery D suffered no combat fatalities during the war? Because that would be very impressive.
That's correct. They did. There was, for as far as I remember, there was one, maybe two illnesses that caused fatality, but there were no combat fatalities. Now, they came very, very close. There was one artillery shell, a barrage that landed on Truman's unit, even took Truman off his horse, and this horse landed on top of him. So there were some very close calls, but no fatalities due to combat of those 198 men. Is correct. It is impressive.
It's very impressive. Now, did his military service continue after the war?
Yeah, he did. He rejoined the reserves, and I'm going to refer to my notes because I don't want to get the title wrong that he's received, but he does rejoin the reserves, and he's eventually promoted to colonel in that service. And it's really interesting because in the 20s and the 30s, he's a county commissioner or county judge, is what they called it, a county judge. It wasn't a legal position. We call it a county commissioner today. For most of the 20s and then the early 30s before he becomes a U.S. senator. And each summer, he's going off to these reserve camps, mostly in Kansas, actually, out in central and eastern Kansas. And he's writing his letters to now his wife and his daughter during that time. There's a photograph of him in one of those reserve camps where he has a mustache. That's pretty rare. He didn't usually have much facial hair, or at least unshaven in times. So we have good records of that time period. And in a way, it's good he went away, because if he was at home, he wouldn't be writing as much. So he's writing about things to Bess Wallace, Truman, because they were married in 1919. This would have been the 20s and 30s. So he does keep that up. Most summers, he's off to reserve camp. And in fact, he tries to volunteer for World War II when he's a senator in 1941. And George Marshall, says, forget about it. He's over 50 at that point. So he doesn't get to World War II, but he does actually try to do that. So he's very much engaged with his military service. and as I said, eventually promoted to colonel.
And then commander in chief.
Exactly. Yeah, by 1945, for sure.
His service brought him into contact with a really, as you've already mentioned, a pretty diverse group of people and really some very important political allies too. So how do you think his experience of World War I informed his future political career and really his view of his fellow Americans?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There's a lot there, actually. There's a couple of key people I'll mention, and then I'll talk to some more about some of the other factors of World War One as well. First of all, Eddie Jacobson, I've mentioned, they met in Oklahoma and set up this canteen. That's what he does when he gets home in the spring of 1919. First thing he does is he gets married in June of 1919, on June 28th, to Bess Wallace, and moves into his mother-in-law's home and lives there the rest of his life, except when he's in the White House. Then he and Eddie set up a men's clothing store called Haberdashery, but nobody knows what that word means anymore, selling shirts and ties and hats. And a lot of his Army veteran friends would come there. They were his prime customers. A very important relationship that you alluded to was with Jim Pendergast, who was in the same unit as Truman, and he's connected to the more infamous boss, Tom Pendergast. He's boss Tom Pendergast's nephew. Truman is very close to Jim Pendergast, and Jim and boss Tom come to visit Truman in the clothing store. And really, they're the ones that set Truman on his political path. So if you think of kind of like the political machine, that's what Tom Pendergast is running in Kansas City and in Jackson County, where both Kansas City and Independence are both in Jackson County, Missouri. And they want him to run for this Jackson County judge position that I mentioned earlier, county commissioner, which he does win with Pendergast's support. It's impossible to win without it. So we don't ignore that connection. And then he does lose one election in the mid-20s, and then he comes back as the presiding judge, like the chair of the commission in the late 20s, and continues to do that. And then that gets him into to be the U.S. Senator from Missouri in 1934. And again, that's with Pendergast's support, so much so that when he arrives in D.C., instead of being described as the senator from Missouri, he's described as the senator from Pendergast. So that really kind of overshadows him. But it's interesting is in the second term as a senator, his military service really comes to a head because he requests and is eventually appointed to look at wasteful spending in the defense industry as we build up to World War II. And he travels all over the country and ends up saving billions of dollars through these investigative proceedings that he has in front of the Senate. And he ends up actually on the front cover of some national magazines as being kind of this no compromising Senate hearing head that is just unearthing all of these incredible misuses of government funds by contractors, particularly in the defense industry. So that kind of makes his name, but I think his World War I experience helps him understand a lot of that as he travels around the country and gives him access, quite frankly, to some of these places too. And then another friendship that's incredibly important is with not particularly an individual, but all of these different members of Battery D, because as he goes into politics, they're campaigning, they're voting for him, they're getting the word out. In a way, it balances the Pendergast influence because he's seen as this fair and upright captain who brought home his battery with nobody harmed, and he has this incredible reputation, which tells you why the Pendergast went after him. But he also has this loyalty that we talked about before with his Battery D members, that they really stand by him and support him as he goes forward. And just one last thing about Eddie Jacobson, it really informs him when he's making his presidential decision over the recognition of Israel. Eddie Jacobson is the one that gets Harry Truman to meet with Chaim Weizmann, who really convinces Truman that Israel needs to be recognized as a nation in 1948. So those friendships could really influence him in some ways. I think the last point I wanted to make is what happened after World War I and the creation of the League of Nations. And, we had Wilson's 14 points, and then they're not ratified by the Senate. And the League of Nations flounders with Mussolini in Ethiopia and those kind of crises. And Truman was a big supporter of that concept. So when he's president, the very first decision he has to make in April of 1945 is whether to attend the first United Nations conference in San Francisco in June of 1945. And Truman goes and he gives the closing address, and he really wants the United Nations to be a much stronger world organization than the League of Nations. And I think his World War I service is a testament to that. He sees how Germany is, in his mind, mistreated and treated too harshly after World War I. And there's some tenets there of him thinking about the Marshall Plan and how to rebuild your enemy after a war. And so the United Nations and the Marshall Plan, I think, can both have some roots in his World War I service when he comes to make those decisions as president. I think that's often overlooked.
No, but that's very interesting, though. I confess, I don't know that I have considered that as much with him, but no, I think you're right there. So any final thoughts?
I just think the final thing is when you think about Harry Truman, he becomes this commander-in-chief in 1945, quite surprisingly, really, because, nobody really knew who he was before the Democratic Convention in 1944, outside of a couple of front-page magazine stories about his work on the defense spending. That wouldn't really be a path to the presidency. But I think we always look at his leadership and his character traits behind that, his perseverance and his honesty and his integrity. And a lot of that is seen in World War I. He had some leadership experience on the farm, and some historians have given that a bit more credit. But I think his leadership in World War I is really outstanding, leading these 198 men. Not only is it a leadership experience, but a really important point here is it gives him the confidence to lead. And that's a different thing. You can be a leader, but you don't have to be, when he's first trembling in front of his knees and knocking, as the soldier said in his oral history, in front of those men, by the time he comes out of there, he has much more confidence to lead. And then he gets his experience in county politics and as a senator. And I think he started to add up all of those responsibilities and those opportunities to lead. For me, it really starts in World War I. He gets that confidence to lead, not just to lead, by the seat of his pants, but really to lead with confidence and to move men quickly and to get them all on target and to work efficiently and things like that. And to be, respected by his men, as we've talked about, that stayed with him the rest of his life, having that respect of his men. So I think that's the last point I would make about his World War I service, is that not only did it give him leadership experience, but it gave him the confidence to lead effectively as well.
We've talked about many different historical figures and their experience of World War I, and I think I have to agree 100%. It is a crucible that really sets a lot of them on the path for obviously their future leadership roles. And it's clear that World War I was that in many respects for Truman. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today and sharing about President Truman's World War I experience.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed the conversation.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.